Okay, we move forward today to your chapter 15. Which deals with recessions in business cycle. So I decided in the meantime to divide up this lecture into two. Originally, the idea was to cover the entire chapter 15 in one lecture, but since this is a very complex and interesting topic, I decided to divide it up into two parts. The first part will be today covering theory of business cycle. Why do we think recessions exist? And what are the basic characteristics of recessions and causes? Causes of recessions. The next lecture should be on Tuesday. We'll deal with what to do about it. We'll touch tangentially in the relative of that issue today, but much more in-depth discussion of the reactions to the business cycle by the governments next time. Policies against business cycle. So we will start with the basic definition as usual today, and then we will proceed into a more detailed theoretical elaboration of how this works. So just a few concepts as usually to give you an overview what we are dealing with here. The first important concept today is recession, its definition and meaning, as well as the reason why the existence of a recessions is a puzzle or a problem that requires certain explanation. The second topic would be historical overview or historical look at some of the major experiences of depression in America and elsewhere, primarily Great Depression, 1930s. And the third concept, or the third motif of today's lecture will be the role of banking, and monetary policy and credit market in business cycle. So, financial causes of business cycle. I'm going to try and explain how the banking and monetary systems create certain distortions in the economy that result in the boom and bust cycle. It's called sometimes the monetary theory of business cycle, arguing that the money and some problems with money and monetary policy are the root causes of recessions. So that would be our game plan for today. So we'll start first with a general overview of the concept of recession. Two lectures ago, I mentioned a kind of usual technical definition of a recession that the American government uses and many other governments. That the recession would be a 2-quarter period of negative economic growth, 6 months of negative economic growth. So essentially, recession is a negative GDP growth, negative real GDP growth. And a period of positive economic growth is called expansion or boom. hence this concept of the boom and bust cycle. Anyone heard of that? Cycle, boom and bust. So a recession is a bust, boom is expansion, which means real GDP growth. And that's what the economic growth looks like in short term and medium term. This is real GDP. This is real GDP. This is time. So every few years, so usually you have this period of economic growth. Here, then a slight recession or a deeper recession, then again economic growth, then recession, then and so on down the line. It's a cyclical pattern of economic growth. So when you average these out over a longer period of time, you get a curve like this. Over a period of 100 years, if you want to look at the average rate of economic growth in America, you add up all annual figures and divide them by the number of years, you get a linear function like that, a line like that, so 3% average annual economic growth, 2%. But in the short term, it's not a linear function, it's this weird stepwise curve that goes up and then down and then once again up and so on down. Now, this is the first question that we have to answer. Why is this so? Why the long-term economic growth is obviously gradual, incremental, and smooth? Why a short-term economic growth is not a linear function? Why is there a fluctuation in economic activity? Why are there booms and busts? It's not self-evident. Why economic growth is not just at a steady pace, average 3%. In America, we had some years with 5-6% economic growth, some years with -6, -7. Why is that the case? Why should we ask this question? Why is that a problem? You may say, okay, who cares? We as microeconomists, as a price theoreticians, should care very much. Somebody who studies the supply and demand and entrepreneurship and basic principles of economic theory should know that this is something that doesn't fit very well into the picture of the free market as an efficient mechanism for production and exchange of goods and services. Why? Because we learned that markets are efficient in clearing the surpluses and shortages, that markets are efficient in producing new goods and services, and that entrepreneurs are very good in perceiving and exploiting the profit opportunities, and that the free market is efficient in rewarding good entrepreneurs and punishing good entrepreneurs. So that's something that we know from a prima facie, a priori economic theory. That's the stuff. If that's the case, then if you select any arbitrary long or short period of time, you would have expected to see some average number of business failures and successes every year. You shouldn't expect, the law of big numbers. When you do an opinion poll, if you take a large enough sample of people, you're going to get a representative sample of the population, and you can predict the outcomes of the elections, more or less, or many other things. So the law of big numbers, actually, that it should be a wash on average. Every single year should have approximately the same number of business failure and same numbers of success. Because entrepreneurs are good at what they are doing. If there is some outside intervention, some outside problem created in the economic system, free market in and of itself is not expected to produce such kinds of such weird kind of pattern in the short run, boom and bust pattern. And that happens. And that's a puzzle because, just to go back for 1 second to one additional aspect. of the theory of entrepreneurship. This part of the line here, economic progress, means that entrepreneurs are good in anticipating consumer demand and in fulfilling or satisfying consumer demand. That the number of errors, of business errors and failures must be very low. And here, it seems that the opposite happens. So we know from a recession that the rate of business failures increases dramatically during a recession, and unemployment increases dramatically, the level of bankruptcies increases dramatically. Now, one question that we should ask ourselves is, how is it possible? And that the recessions hit usually very suddenly over a period of a few weeks or months. How is it possible that the same people who were very good in working with capital, labor, and other factors of production to produce consumer goods, entrepreneurs, who made relatively few mistakes, all of a sudden start to make mistakes in the same direction? How the geniuses who were producing profit until yesterday now become idiots who are making losses overnight. All of them, or most of them. Everybody is losing money, some people more, some people less, on average. There is this phenomenon which is called in your book a cluster of errors. Cluster of errors. So, all of a sudden, a very large number of people seem to have started making mistakes or errors of business judgment in the same time. Now, this is something that is very, very strange from a basic standpoint of logic, let alone economic logic. It requires an explanation to see what happened to them and how is it possible that the same people, the same business agents who were very successful in predicting and satisfying consumer demand until yesterday now become all of them inefficient, insolvent, and some of them bankrupt, all in the same time. So the law of big numbers tells you that this should be impossible. If theory of price theory and entrepreneurship is all there is, if there is not something else that influences the process of economic decision. So that theory of recession has to explain this. This is one of the deepest mysteries, actually, and one of the most difficult questions in economic theory that there is no final consensus about. The story presented in your book, with which I agree to a considerable degree, is one attempt at this. It makes sense, so I decided maybe the best entry point into the discussions of business cycle would be to present this theory of financial and monetary causes of the business cycle. So the basic idea has to be somehow that there is some malign, problematic outside influence with the genuine free market that creates this kind of pattern. It's very difficult to imagine what could have been the reason for entrepreneurs to behave in such a fashion. Something must be happening that forces them into errors. The Great Depression was maybe one of the most traumatic experiences of the 20th century. For Americans, probably the most traumatic experience. It was the deepest economic crisis in the 20th century, and it is much worse than anything else that you or I have ever experienced in our lives. It prompted quite a bit of re-evaluation and soul searching about what causes depressions, and especially what the governments could or should do to prevent recessions. That's a topic for the next lecture. I will tell you that the experience of the Great Depression was the main reason for a much stronger willingness and readiness of economists and policymakers and politicians to accept a larger role of the government in preventing and moderating recessions. We had quite a few of recessions in the 19th century and early 20th century. Yet the prevailing wisdom, the prevailing approach how to deal with them was like a Greek tragic attitude. You cannot do anything about it. Just get over it, wait for a year or two, and recession will pass. It is nothing for government to do. It was treated as a natural occurrence, as a disaster that hits unexplainably and we cannot understand it, but okay, it will pass. Cut our losses, and go pray, and wait until it passes. This passive attitude towards recession is something that we have to bear. This change in the 20th century, the Great Depression, was the main reason for this reevaluation. And Great Depression, you can understand that because that was a period when the gross domestic product fell by, I don't know, by something like 2/3 or so. Its money supply declined dramatically. It created a genuine poverty in the United States. There's pictures of bread lines and unemployed people trying to survive somehow. So it ushered in an era of much stronger governmental activity and government intervention into the economy. So we'll discuss that more next Tuesday. But I just wanted to sketch for you the historical context within which these debates began. One of the important experiences of modern time that contributed to the discussions of business cycle were this Great Recession in 2009, 2008, 2009, 2010, which was very mild as compared to the Great Depression, but the level of panic and the level of critical attention that economists paid to it, it became almost a defining event of one of the defining events of the 21st century. Especially because there was one uncanny parallel between the Great Recession, as it's called nowadays, and Great Depression. There's the financial systems collapsed or near collapsed in both cases. So that was in terms of its effects on ordinary people, this new recession was not particularly hard, but the financial system suffered greatly. And it prompted some new ideas about how to regulate the financial and monetary system. Okay, any questions thus far? So let's now jump into the main topic of the day. It's number 3. What causes recessions in business cycle? How are we to understand this phenomenon? In order to understand this, we have to start from basic insight about what determines the level of investment and production in a given economy. And once we ask this question, the first preliminary answer seems clear, that it is determined by the level of saving in a given economy. By the ratio, if you call it, ratio between saving and consumption. So if you assume that society at any one given point in time has a given income, whatever that might be, $100 million in fixed $1960. And the society as a whole, as a sum of all individuals comprising it, has to make a decision how much of that income is going to be spent on consumer goods right now, and how much of it is going to be saved and then invested into the production processes of various durations or maturities, time periods that are necessary from the start of the production process until the point when the product is sold on the market. So this savings rate is one of the key components and one of the key preconditions for investment. What is the technical instrument that best describes this trade-off between savings and consumption? This concept is called interest rate. An interest rate, you can call it the price of time. That's one definition. Sometimes it's called price of money. I'll explain both are correct, essentially. Both refer to different aspects of one and the same thing. Price of time, price of money. Can you explain me why would anyone say that interest rate in a certain sense is the price of time?
Money costs so much, like interest rate grows over time, so it's the time it takes to pay off.
Yes, so interest rate increases over time. What do you mean by that?
Well, an interest rate is, I guess like it's the money on top of what you already owe, and it's like coming back over time. So the time that it takes to pay back your loan is
high. So interest rate is higher for a longer time, longer maturity loans, or loans given for a longer period of time. Why is that the case?
Inflation.
Okay. Even if we assume that there is no inflation, why that?
They're still giving up their money right now, so.
Yeah, that's giving up the present income, money that you can spend right now for a longer period. This period of postponement and sacrifice is greater. So the time preference is the key, which means that we prefer goods that we can consume right now to the goods that we can consume in the future. So an IOU from a borrower is actually a promise of a possibility to have future consumer goods. And future consumer goods are less valuable than the present consumer goods. More distant the future is, then less valuable the future money at that time period is. So then the higher the interest rate has to be. Okay, now how the interest rates are determined. If interest rate is a price of something, whatever that might be, what is your first reaction if I ask you how is this price determined? That's the basic model that we use for all kinds of prices. There are two forces that determine and establish any price in the economy. Here is price, here is quantity of loans, of money. How would you define an interest rate? A demand for loans and a supply of loans. This is the equilibrium interest rate. This is the price of money. Here on the demand curve, it is shown the demand schedules of lenders or borrowers. Who is on the demand curve? Borrowers, people who have a demand for present money. Who provides the supply as the money lenders. As with any other price, the equilibrium price is determined at the intersection of the supply and demand curves, and then we see that interest rate will be determined as the recession. So for borrowers, lower the interest rate, more money will be demanded. It's basically the first law of demand. So borrowers, investors, so this is the first hint. If you think more carefully about it, you could smell something already here. So borrowers want low interest rates. They might be dissatisfied with interest rates as they are right now. Businessmen like low interest rates. Of course, savers prefer higher interest rates. If you put 100, so then more money will be saved as if the interest rate is greater, less money will be saved if it's lower. Now we can hear, like see, the preliminary injunction or preliminary statement here that the phenomenon of business cycle has something to do with messing with the interest rate. And I'll try to explain now how that is. Before that, one more complication here. You always have to bear in mind that there is not one interest rate. There is an array of different interest rates pertaining to different time periods. And you can draw a simple curve that shows you how the interest rates typically change with an increase in the time duration of the interest rate. Here is the time, or maturity, let's say, and here is yield, interest income, how high the interest rate. And this line, it looks approximately like this. Anyone knows what is it called? Yield curve. It says the longer time period, greater the yield, greater the interest rate will be. Because the yield is a principal plus, or principal plus interest rate minus principal. So it tells you that as you extend the time period, let's say here is 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, and so on. Right? So the interest rate increases. We'll come back to the yield curve. I'll tell you just preliminary now that the movement of the yield curve is a very good predictor of a recession. That's one of the first red lights that starts flashing a couple of months, typically, sometimes even a year before a real recession will hit. And we will see why is that the case, why financial economists and analysts look at the yield curve and then try to figure out a recession is upon us. So yield curve simply demonstrates this basic law of time preference that the longer maturity loans will command a higher interest rate than the shorter maturity loans. 3-month government, short-term government bond will have a lower implicit interest rate than 1 year government bond, or any other kind of financial instrument or investment. Now, if we assume now that we have a variety of these, of the yield curve going back in supply and demand, we will have a variety of graphs like this. Market supply and demand of loans of various maturities. And what will determine all of these supply curves will be a willingness of people to forego present income in exchange for future income, the savings rate. So there is a close connection between saving and interest rate. So now, on a genuinely free market, how a drop in the interest rate can happen? What's going to happen if, for example, take this simple minded example, $1,000 of income, let's say $800 spent plus 200 saved. The simplest way of increasing the level of investment and reducing the interest rate would be to start now spending $6,000 and save 4,000. So now instead of $2,000 worth of 3-month loans, let's say that we're here about people who are ready to lend money for 3 months. Now the supply of 3 months loanable funds, loans available for a period of 3 months will increase. If everybody does this with the same level of income, they redistribute this income between consumption and spending. The level of present consumption will go down, and the level of investment and saving will go up. So this will be shown in this curve. Let's assume that this curve represents a curve depicting the 3-month period loans. How will it be shown? This curve. What will change in this curve? The supply curve will shift to the right. People save more and are ready to pay more money. The supply of loans increased. Remember, movement along the curve and shift in the curve, the difference between that. So at every given interest rate now, people would want to lend more. If the demand hasn't changed in the meantime, greater supply will lead to lower prices. So lower interest rate. So you see, this point here, the first graph, is a quantity, equilibrium quantity. That's a quantity of loans that will be, a quantity of money that will be exchanged in loan transactions. Quantity of money that will be lent and borrowed, that will be transferred from savers to investors or consumers, people who use the money, borrowers. So this is the equilibrium quantity of loans. You see the new equilibrium quantity here. It will increase. So lower interest rate means more investment. That's the reason why everybody likes low interest rates. Now, what is going to happen in a normal economy if just this happens, if the interest rate drops as a consequence of a change in the structure of time preference? The following things will happen. The supply of money for the future business projects increases. That means that society now wants to invest more money into producing stuff for the future, for 3 months, whatever that might be, or 3 years, let's say. So that investment in business projects that are of 3-month or 3-year duration will increase. New employment will be created, new jobs will be created, and so on. So investment in the future projects increases. But in the same time, what happens to consumption? It drops down. So that means that the demand for consumer products or products that are closer in time, closer to completion in time than some other business products will have to decrease. People want less consumer goods now, and they want more consumer goods into the future. So everybody who is producing consumer goods for the present right now, everybody who is engaged in very short-term production processes will have to scale back to limit the expansion. It's a simple arithmetics. It's a very simple principle that changes in savings rate will redistribute investment from the present to the future. And the interest rate is an instrument of measurement of the relative relationship between our needs for future goods and our need for present goods. Lower the interest rate, more concerned about the future goods we are, and less we need the present goods, and vice versa. If the interest rates are higher, that means that we gauge or evaluate satisfaction of present goods much more than the satisfaction of future goods. So here it seems that saving and investment and consumption are coordinated through the interest rates. That's the idea of coordination of saving, investment, and consumption. Coordination in time, which means that we, at every given point in time, we invest and produce and consume the optimal quantity of goods and services in accordance with our preferences. Interest rate is a price that coordinates these three types of activity. Our rate of time preference decreases, which means that we save more and want to consume less. No problem. The credit and loan market will take care of that. There will be a redistribution of resources from short-term business projects to long-term business projects. From consumer goods industries to a longer time producing for the present to longer-term business projects. So this is the coordinating function of interest rate. Now imagine, so now you have a basic picture. What is the purpose of interest rate? Imagine now for a moment that the central bank steps in. Now it says, ooh, demand for loans is too low. It means that interest rate is too high. Can we do something to decrease the interest rate? How about a little bit of open market operations that we discussed last time? Buying government bonds, flooding the credit market with new cash, with new liquidity, and then giving more money to the banks, so as the banks can create more loans and contribute to financial prosperity. So that's one thing that happens. Central bank wants to intervene. But imagine that in the same time, nothing changed here. The time preference remained as it was. People want to spend $8,000 on present goods and $2,000 on future goods. So what is going to happen graphically here? The same thing as before. So the supply of credit will go up. The interest rate will drop. The quantity of loans will increase. Seemingly, there is no difference. Seemingly, it looks like it's completely irrelevant whether new credit is created by people foregoing consumption, sacrificing in order to save, or if government just invented out of thin air new money that didn't exist before. Let's go. It's credit inflation. Interest rate drops, investment increases. Now, here is the rub. What is the problem? The problem begins here. Because what is the difference between scenario 1 without government intervention and scenario 2 with government intervention? The difference is that in the first case, the change was based on a changed genuine time preference of the people, which means that people were ready to, signaling that they're ready to buy less consumer goods right now. So the first operation leads to a reduction in the volume and extent of short-term business projects for the sake of an expansion of the long-term business projects. But what happens here? Here the social rate of time preference hasn't changed at all. People don't want to sacrifice. They want the existing pattern of consumption and investment. So consumption expenditure on short-term business projects will not decline. But in the same time, the expansion of the long-term business projects will expand. So you see what is the problem here? What do you think? Could there be any problem here? There is no reduction of investment in short-term business projects. And there is a huge increase in investment in the longer-term business projects. This is the source of what is usually called economic boom, one of the sources. Because this artificial increase in credit and investment was created by sending a wrong signal, by falsifying the interest rate, by creating an artificially low interest rate, which gives the signal to investors in long-term business projects that the savings rate increases, while on the other hand, not sending a signal to consumers and short-term producers that short-term projects have to be curtailed or limited. So what's going to happen in the short term? Why do we have boom? We have a boom simply because people keep going at the existing pace in investing in short-term projects. Consumption increases. People live on a high standard of living, while at the same time investment for the future increases dramatically. The only problem here is that there is not enough real resources to complete all of these business projects. You know that labor, capital, raw materials and everything else has to be somehow distributed between different automotive utilizations. So artificially low interest rate kind of overstretches our resource base that we have. We simply don't have enough worker, we don't have enough capital, we don't have enough machines, we don't have enough of everything to complete both the short-term business projects and the long-term business projects. In the first case we have, because we curtail, we reduce the short-term investment, and then workers and machines and other resources are freed up to be relocated to the long-term business projects. Okay, so you see another coordination in time. Once you eliminate or reduce 5% the consumer good in the industries, you can shift 5% or more of resources into other business projects. Here there is no redistribution of resources between business projects of different time durations. So for a certain period of time, everything looks hunky-dory. Everybody is satisfied. Prices increase, incomes increase, profitability increases. But you see, one wrong information creates a variety of other secondary complications. All these things are, in a certain sense, false, fake, temporary. High salaries, low unemployment, high profit rates. Everybody is happy. Okay, roaring 20s. You know, the period before the Great Depression was called the roaring 20s, because that is a period of greatest prosperity in America. Part of the problem was that that was a period of artificial economic boom, fueled by low interest rates. People didn't realize that the final consequences of that could be very bad. So when a bust begins, when a recession begins, and how a recession begins, and why a recession has to begin, simply it has to happen because we don't have enough resources to complete all these business projects. Society doesn't have enough resources at all. So the demand for goods, especially for producer goods, everything that we use in the production process, will start increasing. So you know, at the beginning, how you make profit calculations as an entrepreneur. You compare your expected revenue with your expected costs. So prices of labor, prices of capital, prices of everything are lower at the very beginning. And then as time goes by and scramble for resources ensues, when people start slowly realizing that there is not enough labor to work on both like a long-term project of building some skyscraper or some much more short-term business project, then a competition for labor force increases. Demand for labor increases. These two business projects have to fight for the same pool of workers. This increases the prices of labor. This increases then the costs for entrepreneurs. So it turns out all of a sudden that your calculations, initial calculations of profitability were false. And the same applies to all other resources that you use. The scramble for resources and bidding up of the prices of productive factors leads to an increase in cost. So there is one metaphor that an Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, used. That this is a situation that we can compare with a master builder who wanted to make a three-story house. And he thought he had enough bricks to complete it, but then halfway through the third store, he realized that he didn't have enough bricks, didn't have enough material to complete the house. What is he to do now? As the analogy here is that society doesn't have enough bricks, quote unquote, enough labor, enough machines, enough other resources to complete all of these megalomaniac projects, long-term business projects. He has to change the plan. What can he do? He probably wants to finish a building that will be functional, that could be sold to somebody. Probably had to tear down the entire third store and then to make just a roof and then to sell it as a two-story house, which is much cheaper. Financial losses. Is it better to keep going, to keep building a house that you know you cannot finish? That probably not. So the same thing happens here. Recession is the process of, is a point when our master builder realizes that the house cannot be complete. But when a critical mass of entrepreneurs realize that all of their calculations were wrong. Chicken coming home to the roost. And then all of them have to scale back. Some of them have to go 5%, 3%, 4%. So now you see this cluster of error is not so mysterious, actually. That the problem was in the period of the boom when people were over-optimistic, deceived by artificially low interest rates to over-expand in production. And since it takes time to reveal how mistaken these calculations were, a period of boom can last for a certain number of years, usually. However, once the initial errors were discovered, once people start having second thoughts about the profitability of their businesses, a crisis hits. So what is a recession? From this point of view, recession is just a process of correcting the errors of extensive or excessive investment during the period of boom. So recession or liquidation of unhealthy investment is just a correction of the errors made during the period of the boom. So this reverses the usual way how we look at recessions. The usual way how general public looks at this is that the boom is a good thing and we want somehow to avoid recession. Recession is what is bad and we want a perpetual boom. Here, when you look more deeply, it turns out that recession is a necessary self-healing process of the economy. Recession is a correction of the errors that are made, and the problem was in the period of the boom. This just described process of excessive investment was the problem to begin with. So now, what you will see or experience in any episode of recession, you will see unemployment, protracted unemployment. You will see the phenomenon called idle resources. idleness of human labor, idleness of technological resources. So the machinery, equipment, real estate will be underutilized for a certain period of time. Labor will be underutilized, which means there will be higher than usual rate of unemployment and so on. Why is this the case? This is the case because most investments are relatively specific, which means if workers work on a business project that failed, it will take some time for them to find new jobs in some other line of work. If a machinery was used for one specific purpose that is now irrelevant because the project failed, it will take some time to repurpose this machine for something else. And so on down the line. The specificity, relative specificity of factors of production means that that there are costs of transitioning from employing resources for one purpose to another purpose. Okay. So this means that we shouldn't worry too much. Paradoxical, even unemployment is a good thing during a recession. Unemployment is a necessary symptom of the disease, not the disease itself. Because what would you be doing if you say, I want to reduce the unemployment rate during the recession. I want to reduce the degree of technological idleness during the recession. You would be interfering with the process of self-healing of the economy. You would be trying to prop up artificially the business projects that shouldn't have been undertaken to begin with. You would be interfering with the process of relocation of the economy. Or of the process of recovery. Same thing. Master builder, you don't want you want to destroy the third story because you have to make a functioning house. The same applies here. You have to sacrifice a certain amount of labor and capital that were already invested. That's gone now. You don't want to be artificially propping up your master builder to keep building, to keep squandering the bricks on a failed project that could not be completed. Let's say that he needs 1,000 more bricks, he has only 500. But he realizes that the house cannot be completed. Do you want him to spend 500 remaining bricks building walls that will have to be torn down eventually? No. That would be wasteful. By the same token, here you don't want to keep companies keep going and workers being employed and money losing projects. You want the money losing projects liquidated as quickly as possible and then to relocate labor and capital to money creating projects. So that's the explanation. That's a kind of subtle point that why recession is in this worldview is a positive economic benefit or a necessary process of self-healing of the economy. Any questions? How does this compare to the usual approach to business cycle that we have in general public? What do you think? You'll see that many of the recipes that are offered for dealing with the recession go in the direction of trying to boost investment into existing business projects in order to prevent recession, to save some of the problems that were created during the period of the boom. So we can say that there are two basic views of recession in business cycle. One which is prevailing nowadays that says the boom is a good thing and recession is a bad thing, and governments should do everything they can to prevent the boom and to make to prevent the recession and to make the boom permanent. And the second approach is that the boom is the problem. It should be avoided. The government should refrain from artificially inflating the credit supply by low interest rates. And if they don't do such, if they allow the boom to develop, then the best policy approach is to do nothing in a recession, to allow the correction to take place, to allow the market system to cleanse healthy investment from unhealthy, and to go back to solid footing. So this is the basic dichotomy that we deal with in a theory of business cycle. So next class we will be covering in much greater detail this activist approach that is much more prevalent nowadays. So sometimes it is called classical approach. It was popular in the 19th century among the economists. We have the classical approach that says that the recessions are necessary and unavoidable, and they play a useful role in the economic system. And the modern activist approach, sometimes called Keynesian approach, that comes in different varieties. Anyone heard about that? Keynesian, what does that mean? So it's a derivation of the name the British economist John Maynard Keynes was one of the major theoreticians of this latter point of view. Says the government intervention is necessary to prevent. He literally says in his major book to make the boom permanent. That's his policy idea. So that's the major dichotomy. And he says it doesn't matter what is really the cause, the remedy is necessary. Whereas the classical theory that I described you here, it says, no, the cause is the key, and you cannot remedy this thing. If you allow this thing to happen, the best approach is just to sit back and let it unfold as quickly as possible. As quickly as possible. Okay, are there any final questions? Anything at all? Okay, so we finished 10 minutes early. Do you want to discuss something else? Do you want me to let you go slightly earlier today? Okay, any questions? Well, so I will post this lecture and the previous one today, and then we will have the homework assignment for this week and covering the material from this week. Okay then, so let's call it a day, and I'll see you on Tuesday.